Brinkhaven used to be a place where the sun set on quiet streets, where neighbors helped neighbors, and where the clink of a bike bell or the laughter of children could be heard echoing down every block. It was a town where everyone knew each other's name, a place where the police weren't feared, they were trusted. In those days, the badge was a symbol of safety, a promise that justice would be served and the rule of law would protect those in need. But that was before the silence descended. As the years passed, the power in Brinkhaven shifted. The small, tight-knit community that once took pride in its police department gradually became a town ruled by fear. The very men and women who were supposed to protect the people were now the ones controlling them. It all began with Ethan Kowalski, the police chief, whose ambition was as limitless as his cruelty. His rise was slow and quiet at first, like the whisper of a storm building miles out at sea. But soon, Kowalski's grip on the town became undeniable. Kowalski was the kind of man who knew how to smile to your face while stabbing you in the back. He wore his badge like a crown, and the people who worked for him or around him understood one thing. There was no room for dissent. In Brinkhaven, there was no such thing as honest law enforcement anymore, only power, money, and control. His second in command, Darren Reese, was the hammer to Kowalski's cunning. Reese was the enforcer, the muscle. He was the one who made sure that those who dared to challenge Kowalski's reign were swiftly and decisively dealt with. He wasn't just a cop, he was Kowalski's right-hand man, a man without conscience, willing to do anything to protect the chief and their twisted empire. Together they ran Brinkhaven like a mafia syndicate, leaving fear and intimidation in their wake. The real power in Brinkhaven wasn't in the hands of elected officials or even the people who lived there. It was in the hands of two men, Kowalski and Reese. They didn't need to steal outright. They didn't need to pull off heists or bank robberies. No, they had something better, an entire system in place that allowed them to take whatever they wanted. The law, it was theirs to bend and break as they saw fit. Over the years, they had built their empire in the shadows, carefully covering their tracks. It was a well-oiled machine, a network of corruption that reached far and wide. Drug deals, protection rackets, gambling rings, all of it operated under the guise of law enforcement, and no one dared speak up. Because to speak up meant you were either a target or gone. Ethan Kowalski had learned that the hardest part of running a town wasn't the power itself, it was keeping it. Power didn't just come from fear, it came from silence. He knew this, and he knew how to enforce it. He had a group of loyal officers who were more than willing to turn a blind eye to the crimes happening right under their noses. Officers who were in on the take, officers who knew that their jobs depended on their silence. Kowalski had made sure of that. The first step in building his empire was to ensure that the community trusted him. It was an illusion, but it was a necessary one. He made public appearances, took part in town events, and showed the people that he was there to protect them. Behind closed doors, however, he made deals that would ensure his reign would be uncontested. He got his hands on drugs, on money, on dirt that could ruin anyone who stood in his way. It wasn't long before Kowalski and Reese expanded their influence beyond the police department. They had their fingers in every pie. Local businesses, politicians, even the courts. People who didn't play by their rules were silenced, or worse, made to disappear. It was a game of control, and they played it well. But the more control they had, the more paranoid they became. They needed to ensure that there were no loose ends. Every journalist who came too close to the truth was quickly neutralized. The stories they wrote about the missing evidence, the unexplained wealth, the suspicious deaths were quickly buried. Those who didn't take the hint were visited in the dead of night, their lives turned upside down. And when that didn't work, they simply erased them from the picture entirely. It wasn't just the outsiders who were under Kowalski's thumb, it was the officers within the department too. Those who weren't completely loyal to him were quietly pushed out. Officers who had once signed up to serve and protect now found themselves serving and protecting only Kowalski's interests. Those who didn't play along were either quietly demoted or given the opportunity to leave. But it wasn't just Kowalski and Reese's iron grip on the town that made Brinkhaven so eerily silent. It was the fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of violence, fear of becoming the next victim. Families didn't speak out against the cops. And it wasn't just a matter of reputation, it was a matter of survival. When your local police department is more powerful than any politician, more powerful than the mayor, and more powerful than the courts, where else do you turn? It was in this environment of fear that journalists like James Montgomery met their untimely end. Montgomery had been a reporter at the Brinkhaven Tribune, a man who had once prided himself on uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. His articles on missing evidence, discrepancies in the department's financial records, and suspicious deaths had drawn the attention of Kowalski and Reese. One morning, Montgomery's car was found burned to the ground, the unmistakable smell of gasoline lingering in the air. A few weeks later, he had left town, moving to a different city under a different name. He'd been forced into silence, and no one had asked why. The people knew, they knew, but they didn't dare speak it out loud. But the terror didn't stop there. Store owners who refused to pay protection money had their businesses burned down. Local families who complained about the way they were treated by the police found their homes raided for drugs or illegal activity that was never there. The courts, which were supposed to be a refuge for the innocent, had become part of the corrupt system, and yet no one dared to challenge it. The silence that hung over Brinkhaven was deafening. The once vibrant streets were now deserted after dark. Conversations in the grocery store were hushed. Whispers of what might happen to anyone who dared speak out. But as the years went by, the cracks began to form, and they were small at first, unnoticed, dismissed, but they were growing just beneath the surface, because deep inside the walls of Brinkhaven's courthouse, in the files, in the dusty paperwork, in the old case files, there was a quiet rebellion brewing. A woman who had been watching them for months, listening, waiting, working silently in the shadows. Her name was Tiana Rosewood. To the naked eye, Tiana was nothing more than a quiet assistant working in the courthouse archives. She was unassuming, polite, and invisible. But what no one knew was that she had been sent there for a reason. She wasn't a simple records clerk. No, she was an undercover FBI agent, and her mission was clear: dismantle the corruption running through the heart of Brinkhaven. She was playing a long game. Every day she sat at her desk processing papers, cataloging case files, and doing everything in her power to blend in. But behind her unremarkable facade, she was quietly collecting evidence, digging through the paper trails left by Kowalski, Reese, and the other corrupt officers. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She knew it was going to take time. But Tiana Rosewood was prepared to do whatever it took to bring justice to Brinkhaven. And she wasn't alone. Ethan Kowalski had a vision for Brinkhaven, a vision far beyond that of a simple police chief. He wasn't just the enforcer of laws. He was the master of the town, the unseen hand that controlled everything. His power stretched from the courthouse to the darkest corners of the streets, from the businesses that lined Main Street to the criminals who thought they could escape his reach. Kowalski's wealth didn't come from his meager salary as the town's chief of police. It came from a vast network of illegal activities he ran with ruthless precision. Drug deals, extortion, protection rackets, all of it flowed through Kowalski, making him a kingpin in every sense of the word. But no empire is built alone. Kowalski's right-hand man, Darren Reese, was the muscle that kept the power structure intact. Reese wasn't just a loyal second in command. He was the hammer that brought down the law on anyone who dared to oppose them. If Kowalski was the puppet master, Reese was the enforcer, executing his every command with brutal efficiency. If anyone stood in their way, Reese made sure they didn't stand for long. No one was safe. The town was afraid, and Kowalski and Reese liked it that way. It all started innocently enough. Kowalski used his position to manipulate the department's budget, redirecting funds into his own pockets. He forged alliances with local criminals, offering them protection in exchange for their loyalty. But as his wealth grew, so did his appetite for power. The department that once served the people now served him and his empire. And Reese, ever the loyal lieutenant, made sure to enforce Kowalski's will with an iron fist. The first real move that cemented their control came with the rise of the protection rackets. It started with a few small businesses, barbershops, diners, and convenience stores, who were persuaded into paying for protection from the very men who were supposed to be protecting them. They were told in no uncertain terms that if they didn't pay up, their businesses would be damaged or worse. At first, the store owners hesitated, but when their windows were smashed, their merchandise destroyed, and their livelihoods threatened, they quickly realized that Kowalski and Reese were not to be trifled with. Kowalski had a knack for making the deals seem legitimate. He would visit these businesses himself, flashing his badge, offering his services as a protector of the town. "We keep the criminals off your back," he'd say with a smile, his words dripping with false sincerity. And when the terrified owners reluctantly handed over their money, Kowalski would walk away with a smug sense of accomplishment. After all, he wasn't just a cop, he was a businessman who had learned how to turn fear into profit. But Kowalski's grip on the town wasn't just about money, it was about control. The police force had become his private army, and Reese was the one who kept it in line. Reese was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. If anyone dared to cross Kowalski, they didn't just face a slap on the wrist. They faced the wrath of Reese. His methods were brutal and effective, designed to break down anyone who thought they could stand against the chief's empire. One morning, a local journalist named James Montgomery got too close to the truth. Montgomery had been investigating the sudden rise in crime and the police department's suspicious involvement in it. He had dug through records, spoken with informants, and uncovered a trail that led straight to Kowalski's door. He had even started writing an expose on the corrupt practices of the Brinkhaven Police Department, determined to bring the truth to light. But Kowalski couldn't let that happen. The last thing he needed was for someone to stir up trouble. So he did what he did best. He silenced the threat. Reese, ever loyal to his chief, took care of the situation. Montgomery was found dead in his car, burned beyond recognition, a grim warning to anyone who thought they could challenge Kowalski's empire. The message was clear: dig too deep and you'll pay the price. The town was stunned by the murder, but they quickly fell back into silence. Fear was a powerful tool, and Kowalski had perfected it. As the years passed, the murders and disappearances became routine. Journalists who dug too deep were either run out of town or silenced permanently. Store owners who refused to pay protection money found their businesses in flames. It was as if the town was under siege, and Kowalski and Reese were the ones laying siege to it. The people of Brinkhaven had learned a harsh truth. The police weren't their protectors anymore. They were their oppressors. The once trusted department had become a tool of tyranny, and there was no way out. Anyone who dared speak out was either silenced, destroyed, or disappeared. No one could trust the law, and there was no refuge in the courts or the city council. Kowalski and Reese had built an empire on fear, and the town had become their kingdom. But while Kowalski and Reese were enjoying their power, Their kingdom was slowly beginning to crumble. They couldn't see it yet, but there was one person inside their operation who was quietly watching them, a person who had been working under their noses for months, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. She was the one person in Brinkhaven who wasn't afraid, because she wasn't just another helpless citizen. She was an agent of the FBI, and her name was Tiana Rosewood. Tiana had been assigned to Brinkhaven to investigate the police department's ties to organized crime, but she had to be careful. She couldn't afford to blow her cover, not yet. She had to blend in, pretend to be just another assistant in the courthouse archives. But every day she worked quietly in the background, collecting case files, going through evidence, and piecing together the network of corruption that Kowalski and Reese had built. She knew it was only a matter of time before they would slip up. Everyone did eventually. Tiana's training had prepared her for this kind of work. She was patient, methodical, and determined. She wasn't afraid of Kowalski, and she wasn't afraid of Reese. They were ruthless, yes, but they were also predictable. And Tiana had an ace up her sleeve: the truth. The more she dug, the more she uncovered, and the more she realized that Kowalski and Reese had become so arrogant in their power that they had let their guard down. They thought they were untouchable, but they hadn't counted on one thing. There was someone inside their world, someone who could bring them down from the inside. Tiana Rosewood had mastered the art of blending in the back of the Brinkhaven courthouse. Tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the records department, she seemed like nothing more than an invisible cog in the machine. To her colleagues, she was just another administrative assistant, quietly filing away old case files and documents. The type of woman who went unnoticed by everyone until, of course, it was too late. But beneath the ordinary exterior, Tiana was anything but ordinary. Her quiet demeanor hid a mind that was constantly calculating, analyzing, and observing. Every day, while her coworkers shuffled in and out of the department, she sat at her desk, working efficiently, but her real work was happening in the silence between the task of filing. Her eyes darted over old case files, criminal records, and internal memos that most people wouldn't think twice about. What she saw in those documents was nothing less than an unraveling of the law itself, a system that had been corrupted from the inside out. Tiana wasn't just any assistant. She was an undercover FBI agent placed in Brinkhaven to investigate the rampant corruption within the police department. It had taken months for her to infiltrate the department, and she had to tread carefully. Kowalski and Reese were dangerous, ruthless men who had built a network of fear and secrecy, and anyone who got too close to exposing it would vanish without a trace. But Tiana had the training, the patience, and the resolve to dismantle the empire from the inside. And she was doing it one file at a time. Each day, as she sat at her desk, Tiana meticulously combed through old criminal cases. Some of them were from years ago, others more recent. She'd run her fingers over the yellowed paper, flipping through pages of handwritten notes, witness statements, and court decisions. But what struck her the most was what wasn't there. Whole files were missing, as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. Missing evidence, altered reports, official statements that contradicted each other. It was all a carefully constructed web designed to shield Kowalski and Reese from scrutiny. There were cases where criminals were allowed to walk free, their charges mysteriously dropped. Then there were others where people who had no business being arrested were sent away for crimes they hadn't committed. Tiana's heart sank as she read through the discrepancies, recognizing the clear pattern. Those who paid into Kowalski's protection racket, whether it was through bribes or other means, were let off the hook. The ones who didn't comply, however, were quickly railroaded into the system and silenced in the most brutal of ways. One file in particular stood out to her. It was a cold case that had never been solved. The victim, a local businessman named Harold Jenkins, had been found dead in his home, and the police had written it off as a simple robbery gone wrong. But something about the case felt off to Tiana. The timeline didn't add up, the evidence didn't fit the narrative, and the initial investigation seemed half-hearted at best. As Tiana read through the reports, she realized that the real reason Jenkins had been killed was far more sinister. He had been getting too close to uncovering Kowalski's operation, and in the end, he had paid the price for it. It wasn't just the missing files or altered reports that concerned Tiana. It was the cases that had been buried altogether. There were dozens of them, all involving people who had gone up against Kowalski and Reese, only to vanish from the public record. Tiana couldn't shake the feeling that she was staring into the dark heart of a much larger operation. This wasn't just about a corrupt police chief and his enforcer. No, this was an entire system designed to operate under the radar with enough power to destroy anyone who got in their way. But Tiana wasn't afraid. Fear was something she had long since left behind. The training she had undergone with the FBI had prepared her for the darkest corners of human nature, and what she had uncovered in Brinkhaven was a nightmare, sure, but it wasn't one she couldn't handle. She had learned how to compartmentalize her emotions, to focus solely on the mission. Her goal was clear: to take down Kowalski and Reese, not just for the sake of justice, but for the people who had suffered at their hands. And she would do it quietly, methodically, and from within. It was during one of her long shifts in the records department that she first caught wind of the deeper corruption running through the force. A confidential memo, one that had been misfiled, found its way into her hands. As she skimmed through it, her stomach dropped. The memo outlined an operation, a major drug deal that was being run directly under Kowalski's watch. The deal was scheduled to go down in just a few days, and there were even notes about how the police would be involved in the protection of the shipment. The document was proof that Kowalski's corruption ran far deeper than anyone could have imagined, and it gave Tiana the ammunition she needed to bring him down. But even with this new evidence, she had to remain cautious. Kowalski's eyes were everywhere, and Reese was always nearby, lurking in the background, ready to squash any threat to their reign. Tiana knew she couldn't act alone, not yet anyway. She needed to gather more evidence, make sure the FBI had a rock-solid case before they moved in. And the only way to do that was to continue playing the part of the quiet assistant, silently cataloging everything she could find. But Tiana was getting closer to her goal. Every day she grew more confident, more certain that the walls surrounding Kowalski's empire were starting to crack. She was beginning to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just the police force she needed to take down. It was the entire network of corruption, the drug rings, the protection rackets, the bribery, and the murder that had been allowed to flourish under the false guise of law and order. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, and with every passing day it became harder and harder to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, Tiana's resolve hardened. She knew she had to be patient. The stakes were too high for any rash moves, but the quiet watcher was no longer just an assistant in the records department. She was a force in the making, a woman with a plan, and the tools to execute it. Her eyes were trained on Kowalski and Reese, and soon enough they would know that their empire was about to come crashing down. The dim flickering light of the old records room cast long shadows on the walls as Tiana sat hunched over her desk, staring at the computer screen. The hours had stretched on and on, her fingers working tirelessly, not just to organize documents, but to expose a web of corruption that had been festering for years. She had spent months in Brinkhaven, a small town whose streets were cloaked in fear. And now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to click together, she could almost feel the weight of it. Every piece, every hidden transaction, every lie finally coming to light. Her fingers paused over the keyboard as the encrypted file finally finished decrypting. Her pulse quickened. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The file she had risked everything for. The one piece of evidence that would bring Kowalski and Reese to their knees was now laid bare in front of her. It was a digital ledger, one that detailed every illegal transaction, every payoff, and every secret deal made between the police department and the criminals running amok in Brinkhaven. Each line was a thread, each entry a revelation. The network that had flourished under the guise of law and order was now exposed in black and white. Tiana's eyes scanned the file, each word a piece of the puzzle she had been carefully assembling for months. The document laid out the full extent of Kowalski's operation, from drug deals protected by the department to illicit bribes taken from local criminals in exchange for immunity. It detailed false arrests, evidence tampering, and even murder, crimes that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and fear. What was most damning, though, was the list of names. High-ranking officials, judges, local business owners, every player in the town's corrupt underworld was listed in those pages, and Tiana now held the key to bringing it all down. Her breath caught as she read further. There, buried at the end of the file, was something even more sinister. A list of officers involved in the murders of witnesses and whistleblowers, their deaths chalked up to accidents or natural causes. The dark truth of Kowalski's reign became even clearer. He was willing to kill anyone who got too close to the truth. That meant anyone who had spoken out against him or tried to expose the corruption. Tiana's stomach churned at the thought of what would happen if she failed. The implications of the file were enormous. It wasn't just a matter of taking down two corrupt cops anymore. It was a matter of dismantling an entire criminal empire that had infiltrated the heart of law enforcement itself. This was a conspiracy so vast, so deeply embedded, that exposing it would shake Brinkhaven to its core. But Tiana couldn't back down. She couldn't afford to. The file was the final piece of evidence she needed, and it was time to act. She closed the document and took a moment to steady her nerves. This wasn't just about filing a report or handing the evidence over to her superiors. No, this was going to be dangerous. The corruption had eyes everywhere. She could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. Kowalski and Reese had their own network of spies, informants, and enforcers scattered across town, and once they found out she was onto them, she knew they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her. She could already feel the target on her back, the pressure of knowing that every move she made had to be perfect. Tiana gathered the encrypted file and placed it carefully into a secure USB drive, tucking it safely into her jacket pocket. She stood up and walked over to the filing cabinet in the corner, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had planned for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare her for the weight of it. Taking down Kowalski and Reese would not only shatter the corrupt empire they had built, it would send a message that no one, not even the highest-ranking officers, were above the law. But there was no time to waste. The longer she stayed in Brinkhaven, the more danger she was in. She had to get the evidence to the right people, fast. She couldn't risk staying in the department for much longer, not with Kowalski's men constantly watching every corner. The moment they found out she was onto them, it would be game over. Tiana made her way toward the back exit of the courthouse. Glancing over her shoulder, her senses heightened. She knew every inch of the building, every nook and cranny, but tonight felt different. There was an unfamiliar weight in the air, a sense of looming danger that made her skin crawl. The hallways were quieter than usual, the silence heavy as she walked through the building, each footstep echoing in the empty corridor. She had to move fast. Every second felt like an eternity. But just as she reached the back door, she heard it, a faint noise in the distance, a door opening, footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat as she froze, pressing herself against the wall. The sound grew louder, closer. She held her breath, praying they hadn't seen her. A few more seconds passed before the footsteps finally faded, and Tiana exhaled in relief. She knew she couldn't afford to make a mistake now. She stepped into the cool night air, the file still safely tucked away. The town was quiet, but Tiana knew better than to let her guard down. She had to get to the rendezvous point, the safe house where the FBI team had been waiting for her call. They had been monitoring her progress from the outside, ready to move in once she had the evidence. But now, with the file in her possession, she could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on her. She wasn't just running from the corrupt cops anymore. She was running from a system that had been built to protect itself at all costs. As she walked through the empty streets, Tiana's thoughts raced. Would she make it out alive? The question echoed in her mind, a constant nagging voice. She couldn't afford to think about failure. She couldn't afford to think about what might happen if Kowalski and Reese found out what she was doing. She had to stay focused, get the evidence to the FBI, expose the corruption, and bring down the system that had allowed men like Kowalski and Reese to flourish. But as she neared the safe house, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. Tiana's heart skipped as she opened it. I know what you're doing. Don't think you can run. We're watching. Her blood ran cold. The message was a threat, a clear warning from Kowalski's men. They knew she had the evidence. They knew what she was about to do. The walls were closing in. The day of the trial had arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. The courtroom in Brinkhaven was packed, its benches filled with officers, judges, and local town officials. They had gathered here for one reason: to ensure that the corrupt officers, Police Chief Ethan Kowalski and his right-hand man, Darren Reese, would walk free. The system had worked for them once again. The courtroom was a stage, a carefully orchestrated performance where everyone knew their lines and played their parts. The fix was in, and everyone in the room knew it. But as the trial began, something unexpected happened. The defense was droning on, offering their rehearsed excuses and justifications for the charges against Kowalski and Reese. They spoke of misunderstandings, innocent mistakes, and the pressures of being in law enforcement. As they babbled on, Kowalski and Reese sat smugly at the defense table, their expressions one of arrogant confidence. They exchanged glances, exchanging a brief, knowing smile. They were untouchable. This trial would be no different than the others. They would get away with it, just like they always had. Tiana Rosewood had spent months preparing for this moment. She had worked quietly in the background, cataloging every piece of evidence, compiling every crime, every document, every transaction, and now she had finally gathered enough to bring down the entire corrupt empire that had been ruling Brinkhaven. But in that moment, as the defense continued, she knew that what she had to do next was going to shake the room to its core. With a sudden, almost imperceptible movement, Tiana stood up. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had been calm under pressure before, but this was different. This was the culmination of everything, the culmination of months of quiet observation, endless days of collecting evidence, of walking on the edge of danger. She knew what was at stake, and now it was time to reveal the truth. Your Honor, Tiana said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. I have something to say. The judge, a middle-aged man with a permanent scowl, looked at her with a mixture of confusion and irritation. Ms. Rosewood, you're not a witness. Please sit down. But Tiana didn't sit. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the room full of people who had no idea what was about to happen. She could feel the weight of the room's gaze on her, curious, questioning, but unaware of what she was about to reveal. I'm not just Ms. Rosewood, she continued, her voice now echoing throughout the silent courtroom. I'm the FBI director. A wave of stunned silence swept through the room. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. No one moved, no one spoke. The entire courtroom was frozen in shock. The defense attorney's face turned pale, his mouth hanging open as he tried to comprehend what was happening. Kowalski's face, however, was the most telling. It drained of all color, and his confident, smug expression shifted into one of utter disbelief. His eyes darted quickly to Darren Reese, who was sitting beside him, now visibly tense. Tiana could hear Reese's hand moving toward his waistband, where his gun was holstered, but she didn't flinch. She had been prepared for this moment for months. She had anticipated every move, every reaction. She had expected the panic, the disbelief, the attempts to silence her, but she wasn't afraid. I am Tiana Rosewood, she continued, and I've been working undercover in your police department for the past several months. Everything you've done, everything you thought you had hidden, everything has been documented. The bribes, the payoffs, the murder, the drugs, the protection rackets, it's all in here. She raised a small USB drive, a symbolic gesture that carried the weight of the truth. This is the key to everything, the evidence that will expose your crimes and bring you down. The room remained eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Even the prosecution seemed taken aback by Tiana's declaration. They had been expecting an ordinary witness, not a bombshell revelation like this. Kowalski's eyes narrowed, and his fingers twitched as though he was weighing his options. He was a man who was used to being in control. He had manipulated, threatened, and silenced anyone who had dared to challenge him. But now the unassuming assistant he had dismissed as insignificant had revealed herself to be something much more dangerous, the person who held the key to his downfall. Tiana could feel the tension rising in the room as all eyes turned to Kowalski and Reese. Kowalski was staring at her, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Darren Reese, now standing beside him, had his hand on his gun, ready to make a move, but he hesitated. His eyes flicked between Tiana and the crowded room, calculating his next move. He had always been the enforcer, the muscle, but now he was facing something far more powerful than he could handle. You're making a huge mistake, Rosewood, Kowalski sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. You have no idea what you're about to unleash. Tiana didn't flinch. I know exactly what I'm doing, she replied calmly. And this is over. Your empire is finished. As the words left her mouth, she saw the first cracks in Kowalski's facade. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He was losing control, and it was happening in front of an entire courtroom. This was the moment that everything had been building toward, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. The judge, now visibly shaken, cleared his throat. Ms. Rosewood, you're the FBI director? His voice was shaking, but his shock was quickly replaced by a sense of confusion. But how could you have been working inside the department this whole time? I've been here long enough to gather enough evidence to expose everything you've been doing, Tiana said. The FBI has been watching, and now the entire town will know what you've been hiding. The room erupted in chaos. Some of the officers in the courtroom scrambled to stand, but no one knew what to do. Kowalski's face was red with rage as he stood up abruptly, his hand still hovering over his weapon. Reese moved toward him, but the tension in the air was so thick it felt as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Tiana stood firm. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when everything would change. Her revelation had exposed Kowalski's reign of terror, but there was no guarantee that the system would allow justice to prevail. The battle for Brinkhaven's future was just beginning.